Previously, we considered the possibility that our customary way of perceiving and understanding the world is promoted not for its total accuracy, but rather for its threat detection capability. Our ancestors lived for a colossal number of years with the distinctly unsettling experience of confrontation with other species of people who ambushed them for millennia. Thus was rooted a hypervigilance for all things strange and dangerous. Yet we also surmise that there must have been a parallel perceptual path for daily or nightly encounters with the uncanny, a non-defensive posture that perceived such occurrences more fully and contextualized them in the grand scheme of a ubiquitous paranormal, a curiously glitchy, expanded reality. The evidence suggests that our ancestors saw the strange everywhere, knew it to be foundational and structural to reality, adapted to it, and relied on it. They also saw it within themselves, comprising them and defining them. We are mysterious entities. We are not limited to that which our threat categorization consciousness believes us to be. In this episode, we begin our exploration of who we are and how we think, with the haunting story of a man wearing a horse mask and circling a large, strong whirlpool at dusk. Though he does not know it, in less than 30 minutes, that young man will be dead, pulled down and drowned by the swirling waters. As we watch this footage of this man cavorting and playing with an enormous force of nature, a certain sense of exhilaration blended with dread arises in us. Similar to when watching a fellow human being step out toward the precipice of a cliff, only a much more dynamic threat here. Every child has watched the whirlpool water swirling down the bathtub drain and wondered whether they might be taken with it. Jacob Cockle was swimming in the maw of a submerged, gigantic 40-foot sluiceway that torrents water into the River Hale with enough scouring action to dredge the nearby harbour of sand with every spring tide. Kansu Pool was and is a death trap. What was Jacob thinking? Jacob Cockle was in his element. A celebrated photographer of turbulent water, he was known for throwing himself into heaving surf to capture spectacular images of waves and spume from the chaotic waterline. Jacob was 28 years old the day he jumped into Kansu Pool to film underwater the swirling vortex of the sluice whirlpool. He was a very strong swimmer with an athletic body. For the previous half hour, he had been allowing himself to be taken by the gyre, then kicking his way out again to its eddying ring. When we see him defy the event horizon like this, we begin to share the feeling that, no doubt, filled Jacob. A wild, dreamlike joy crossing impossible boundaries. One can begin to imagine that there is even a particular geometry to Jacob's body and to the circumstances, a hydrodynamic grace that allows us to flow through such boundaries, play with the scales of reality, become at once a mote and a galaxy, a piece of coloured glass in an infinite kaleidoscope, belonging to every fractal. What Jacob Cockle may not have realised was that his wetsuit, his neoprene sealskin, was keeping him buoyant at the surface, immune to the undertow of the vortex. When he dove down for some final images of the crystalline tornado underwater, his wetsuit was compressed and lost its buoyancy, and the cyclone grabbed him, overpowered him, and took him to its deadly singularity. Another thought that probably did not come to Jacob's mind, encased within the rubber horse head mask, as he circled the vortex of Kansu Pool while neighing with pleasure and fear. Another thought which did not occur to him was that he was, in that moment, a whirlpool within a whirlpool. Here's what I mean. In the 1960s and 70s, a problem was troubling the academic world of evolutionary biology. If life is governed by physics and thermodynamics and the highly predictable behavior of molecules, how can it survive? How can it respond and adapt to calamities? How can it seemingly grow more complex? Why do we have giraffes and birds of paradise and not just E. coli? Is there no spiritus animus that fills us and guides us toward the angels? The French biologist Jacques Monod delivered a devastating parry thrust for physical determinism in his book Chance and Necessity. In it, he argues that determinism happens on every scale of biological existence. Every process is necessary because there is no alternative. Given the circumstances, the ingredients and conditions and catalysts, what happens is what must happen. Chemistry and physics are invariant in their outcomes. For every apparent choice point in the process of an organism, every moment for free will and intent is the result of complex feedback loops amplifying certain processes, making the raw materials more abundant, lowering the threshold for catalysis, dampening the possibilities of other events. In other words, tilting the system this way and that, like an arcade player shaking and bumping the pinball machine to skew the mechanics and score higher. However, Jacques Monod argues that there is no sentient being trying to win here. Merely, certain preferred higher-order sequences of events reach down and give a leg up to lower-level, smaller-scale processes. Specifically, he argues that those chance DNA mutations, which make the operations of replicating and preserving that DNA information more secure, are the mutations which will endure and transmit. The prominent synthetic biologist Gerald Joyce summed up this perspective by saying, "Life is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution." Where Jacques Monod comes across as advocating for a model of the person as a highly elaborate mechanical automaton, Russian-Belgian Ilya Prigogine, working just a handful of years later, turns that complexity on its head. Complexity theory, and its parent study, chaos theory, tells a strange tale about mid-level mesoscale randomness, the chance to which Monod alluded. This is not the extremely bizarre uncertainties and superposed indeterminate states which populate the unfathomably small scales of quantum dynamics. That utter weirdness of the very, 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 very small will come back to haunt us as we investigate thought and perception. But not yet. No, we're talking about here the seemingly random uncertainty of this world of much, much larger objects with which we are all familiar. Will it rain? Will a leaf fall from a tree? Will a shark catch a fish? Will a person stay strong and live to 100 years, or fall ill and die in middle age?
Come to say hi. Look at that, so silly.
There's a surprising amount of the unexpected in mesoscale reality. Complexity theory suggests that there is inescapable unpredictability to complex events involving even familiar objects and systems. And what is more, this inability to predict outcomes is not due to limited knowledge and situational blindness on the part of the observer. Not even a god in heaven can tell exactly what will happen next. Why? Tiny variances in the starting conditions of any situation means that if you play the scene through twice, the outcomes will diverge, often only slightly, imperceptibly, but sometimes wildly. But hang on a second. Isn't everything on the mesoscale averaged out and completely well described by parameters that can be measured and defined? How can making a few tiny changes to the settings on a situation end up driving circumstances into entirely different territory? Also, what has any of this to do with whirlpools? We'll get back to them in a minute. Here's the point. The objects around us, which seem obvious and well described and self-contained, are in fact subtly and incredibly entangled, influencing each other and dependently co-forming all the time. The closer we look, the more carefully we measure, the more interwoven we find the constituents of reality to be, a truth that shaped our expanded paranormal or supernormal reality since the deep antiquity of the planet. Nothing can be taken out of context and named a thing unto itself. Ilya Prigogine was vexed by the conundrum of life forms becoming more complex. You see, the complex and unpredictable interwoven tapestry of this physical reality, including life, can only exist if the dynamic forces shaping it are juxtaposed and almost evenly matched. Too powerful and commanding a dynamic can collapse the whole thing into a paralyzed monotony where nothing comes alive. Nothing builds to more than the sum of its parts. Increasing entropy, that tendency of all systems to move toward maximum energy distribution and unavailability, should be just such a commanding dynamic to nullify complex life. Moment by moment, the universe, and every subroutine and structure within it, slides toward disintegration, disorder. So, how is life cheating the rules? Prigogine hypothesized that there are unpredictable, temporary structures which self-organize to funnel and accelerate entropic disorder, limited access highways to chaos. He called them dissipative structures. To illustrate Prigogine's groundbreaking concept, let's consider a mesmerizing example from chemistry, the Belousov-Jabotinsky reaction. This fascinating chemical reaction demonstrates how order can emerge from chaos in non-equilibrium systems. As we observe, the color of the solution oscillates between red and blue, creating hypnotic patterns when viewed in a thin layer. It's as if the chemicals are engaged in an intricate dance, defying our expectations of how disordered systems should behave. What we're witnessing here is a chemical oscillator, a prime example of a dissipative structure. Despite the overall increase in entropy, we see the spontaneous formation of these beautiful, organized patterns. This paradoxical behavior, order emerging from chaos, is at the heart of Prigoghine's theory. The Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction serves as a powerful metaphor for the emergence of cognitive processes from the complex neuronal activity in our brains. Just as this reaction creates organized patterns from seemingly chaotic chemical interactions, our thoughts may emerge from the intricate dance of neurotransmitters and electrical impulses in our neural networks. Consider the parallels. In both cases, we see complex organized behavior arising from the interactions of simpler components. The swirling patterns in the chemical reaction mirror the waves of activity we observe in brain scans. Both systems are far from equilibrium, constantly consuming energy to maintain their organization. There is a textbook, quintessential example of a non-living dissipative structure: the whirlpool. You can't pick up a whirlpool and look at it, or take it with you. It is inseparable from its context. It is not an object unto itself. Yet it has an organized and coherent form. There's no mistaking it. Whirlpools don't have to exist. Indeed, it is possible for water to simply spill down through a drain pipe and come to a lower elevation, decrease its potential energy, expend its kinetic energy, and arrive at a dissipated, lower energy state, increasing the entropy of the situation. Yet, here's the thing. A whirlpool actually functions to accelerate the increase of entropy more quickly than simply the laminar flow of a fluid alone. It moves the water faster, in an organized way, to a lower energy state. Dissipative structures, forming in systems far from equilibrium, often exhibit reiterative fractal patterns due to the self-organizing processes driven by the continuous flow and dissipation of energy. These patterns emerge as the system evolves through repeated cycles of instability and reorganization, creating complex, scale-invariant structures. Dissipative structures require input and output of material, and can only exist on a gradient of dynamic, moving energy. If that sounds familiar, it's because those conditions also describe the requirements of your existence and every living organism. You are a dissipative structure. Your complexity steepens the gradient and flow toward disorder, and yet, you are towering, mighty, and dangerous in that intricacy. You are a whirlpool, a tornado. And, like any vortex, you cannot be lifted free of the context of your media. You are an interference pattern at the crossroads of thousands of vector paths that converge for a moment into making you. We return now to the theme of this episode, which is nature of thought. As you can imagine, by circling around to the cognition process by way of the theory of dissipative structures, we now have a very different set of questions from the usual discussion which has historically defined the investigation of thought. How so? Well, let's stage a contest of theories. In one corner of the ring, we have theories of cognition dating back to the 1940s and 50s, have typically imagined thought to be similar to the function of computer code, blocks of symbolic instruction, which sequence a series of procedural operations to solve particular problems.
While the card is in the punching station, you will not be able to see the column which you are punching. You can read the printed characters at the top of each column you have punched, as soon as they are more than 2 columns beyond the punching station.
The mind was pictured as creating an abstract and simplified model of the physical world, and then manipulated logically, which is mostly a way of saying we make linguistic statements and see which statements are valid and which are not, according to certain rules of syntax. 3 consequences shake out of this theory right away. One is that our thinking is intrinsically language-like, optimized to tell a story, linear, persuasive when it is internally coherent, representative and referential. The second consequence is that our thinking is purposeful. In this cognitive theory, we construct thoughts as deliberate operations. There is a baseline, machine code, which has structural potency of command. Thoughts are not half-baked. The third consequence is that our thinking cannot investigate all of reality accurately. Our thoughts cannot touch truth directly. Instead, we can only test the logical consistency of our statements, that is, the elegance of our language. However, there are possibilities we cannot think about and determine if they are real and true.
Just work the angles, baby. Work the angles.
Okay, go on then. Totally, I didn't bring my glasses, did I?
So, we have Jacob Cockle swirling around the whirlpool that will kill him in less than half an hour's time. In this theory of cognition, Jacob would have modelled the whirlpool in his mind as an abstract object, made instantaneous comparisons and associations with other similar phenomena he had either witnessed or learned about. He would have made a mental picture of himself swimming in it, run through several logical queries and tests about his abilities and options in various hypothetical scenarios, and then concluded that he was within the bounds of safety to pitch his body into the maelstrom. What his computer-like mind didn't model correctly, didn't logically conclude, was the sudden danger of diving down to meet the funnel. This information had either not been fed into his awareness, or had been edited out of his self-consistent idea of his swimming prowess and the possible conditions he would face. In fact, there is a name for this particular cognitive error, called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Comedian John Cleese describes it perfectly.
And I worked with, or have taught a bit with a fellow called David Dunning, who is a social psychologist whom I adore, who's come up with a theory that explains the world better than any other theory. He says he's discovered that he's been fascinated by how good people are at knowing how good they are at doing things. Self-assessment. He's discovered that in order to know how good you are at something requires almost exactly the same skills as it does to be good at it in the first place. So that if you're absolutely no good at something, you lack exactly the skills that you need to know you're no
It all makes terrible sense, except for one thing. By all accounts, Jacob Cockle was more of a jump first, ask questions later kind of guy. In the other corner of our contest ring, we have a theory of thought as a product of dissipative structure formation, emerging into consciousness at the boundary of complex, unpredictable intricacy and pure chaos. Bear in mind, a dissipative structure can form if and only if there is an opportunity for entropy to increase faster than it would otherwise. This suggests that thought itself is more of a storm-like phenomenon than a stacked brick building. Its ultimate destination isn't stable coherence.
Possibly their only contact with the outside world is a friendly voice that emanates from this room. Here, indeed, is one of the nerve centers of New Zealand. This particular watch is conducted on the 600-meter medium-frequency waveband and is a constant insurance for the safety of life at sea. For 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, this radio set is constantly in use, searching for contact with ships of the 7 seas. On this wavelength, all stations cease ordinary transmission for 3 minutes in every half hour to allow distress calls to receive priority, and the clock is marked as a reminder.
Let's look more closely at this theory of unpredictable thought. The author Aldous Huxley suggested that cognition may depend on a mind-brain relationship that is more like tuning a radio receiver than opening and closing logic gates in a wetware computer. In his analogy, the mind exists in a noosphere that the brain receives by tuning into the correct channel for that thought. In this way, the mind is not constrained by or limited to the capacities of the brain. Rather, the brain is a resonator device that can be harmonically aligned with various thought fields which surround it. To better understand Huxley's analogy, let's consider an experience from his own life that likely influenced this perspective. In May 1953, under the supervision of psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, Aldous Huxley ingested mescaline, a psychedelic compound. During this experience, Huxley reported a dramatic shift in his perception of the world. He described it as if a valve in his mind had been opened, allowing a flood of sensory information and insights that were typically filtered out in everyday consciousness. Huxley wrote about this in his famous essay, The Doors of Perception, stating, "The function of the brain and nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by this mass of largely useless and irrelevant knowledge, by shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive or remember at any moment, and leaving only that very small and special selection which is likely to be practically useful." This experience led Huxley to conceptualize the brain not as the source of consciousness, but as a reducing valve, or, as we've mentioned, a tuner. In this model, the brain acts like a radio receiver, typically tuned to a narrow band of frequencies useful for everyday survival. However, under certain conditions, be it through meditation, psychedelics, or perhaps even in moments of extreme focus or danger, this tuner can shift, allowing access to a broader spectrum of consciousness. This perspective aligns intriguingly with our discussion of dissipative structures and the vast amount of information our brains process subconsciously. It suggests that our normal waking consciousness might be just one station among many in a vast spectrum of possible mental states. Neurologist Robin Carhart-Harris has described the state of affairs this way. The entropic brain theory suggests that psychedelics induce a state of increased entropy in the brain, allowing for greater flexibility and integration of information, the neural correlate of the expanded consciousness people report. This way of thinking about the mind-brain consciousness problem is not far-fetched. Inside the brain, a veritable storm of electrochemical activity is taking place. In May of 2024, a study was published in the journal Science, detailing how scientists used an extremely high-resolution electron microscope to visualize the synaptic connections among the neuron cells of the brain cortex. In just 1 cubic millimeter of brain tissue, about the size of a grain of sand, researchers counted nearly 150 million synaptic connections. It is estimated that the cerebral cortex, the outer region of the brain that contains centers of advanced cognitive processes, holds 150 trillion such synapses. Traveling down neuronal pathways to these synaptic junctions are billions upon billions of electrochemical pulses, discharge waves that use up potential energy and raise the entropy of the brain system. Sometimes those pulses are chaotic, arising and vanishing in a moment, like waveforms in a choppy sea. Yet, astonishingly, sometimes those waves synchronize with each other, so that whole regions of the brain are flashing electrically together in organized patterns that stabilize. Recent research suggests that the electrical and magnetic fields which are generated by these unison flash events and are responsible for the brain waves registered by EEG do propagate deeper into the brain, where they can stimulate other regions to electrical order or disorder. By coming in and out of phase with itself, the brain can really tune in different frequencies and channels of mind. Incredibly complex, overlapping electromagnetic fields can even unify disparate parts of the brain in synchronized activity, an enormous clue that points to the origins of a unified consciousness. Phenomenally, your conscious process begins before you are aware of it. This is true in every moment by moment. At the most basic level, there is a constant throughput of micro-scale electrical excitations of your neurons, individually firing without a larger pattern. This is the static snow of your mind. None of these voltage fluctuations rises to the level of a thought form. They are the ghosts in the machine, signals evoked by the environment, by quantum-level state changes, even by high-energy cosmic rays. Yet, the interesting turn is that current research suggests these voltage fluctuations can amplify to become thoughts if enough neurons get pulled into the excitation pattern and begin to fire in unison. One reason that might happen? If the collective activity channels the electric potential energy to a lower state more efficiently, or if the thought forms that arise from the collectively organized activity causes you as the megafauna organism to behave in ways that shuttle energy to a diffuse state more efficiently. Think about that. Your thoughts exist because they provoke you to do activities that accelerate the universal energy system. It's not a one-off process either. Because the world is constantly evolving and growing more complex, the energy streams and data streams never run out to infinitely weak and diffuse. There is a constant diet of material and energy for a world of dissipative structures to process. Without even realizing it, you are perceiving up to 11 million bits of information per second. To put it back into binary computer science terms, which falls short of the analog complexity in this theory of mind we're discussing. Of those 11 million bits, you can only consciously process 40 to 50 bits per second, and be aware you're doing it. That's 0.00004% of your mental activity. The rest is subconscious, mysteriously threaded through your cognition, the iceberg beneath the water. Speaking of which, let's return now to Jacob Cockle. Such a dynamic and unbounded theory of cognition leaves the doors of thought wide open to impulsiveness, subconscious suggestion, hidden strange attractors, and other features shaping the contours of the mental landscape at the intersection of perception and the phenomenal world. Jacob Cockle was a person orbiting the funnel of a powerful whirlpool. He was also like a whirlpool, various currents within him, stirred by the gravitational pull of his high-risk activities. Subconscious allure to the waves and swirling eddies, the physical sensations of the whirlpool that drew him inward and down, conjuring certain exhilaration, resonances and desires that shaped his thoughts and his willingness to go beyond the guardrails of the familiar. As he filmed his final moments, he mentioned that he was frightened by the intensity of the water. Yet, he continued to swim, continued to play with his undoing. He was also a thing that cannot be extracted from his circumstances and elemental nature. The computer science cognitive theory is not completely wrong. Our cognitive processes are particularly attuned to symbols, more than to objects themselves. That is to say, we notice properties held in common between objects more than objects themselves, in their own totality. This allows us to categorize, as we explored in the previous episode. However, as we might now suspect, symbols can be understood as dissipative structures, each one an open-ended system rather than a closed token. In the next episode, we will explore how this can be, what the implications are for a world of interconnected relations that are everywhere, signaling to each other. We will turn to the strange magic of signs and sigils, and discover how metaphors can emerge from the background noise of the world data stream, find resonance with other dissipative structures, including our own neural net consciousness, and reinforce themselves through multi-scalar repetition. We will examine our responses to this world that is beckoning to us with constant meaning, constantly emerging symbolism, and address the question of whether there exists free will. It is a question that must haunt the friends and family of Jacob Cockle. Did he have any will to choose to dance or not to dance with the whirlpool? Or was he compelled by vortices beyond his ken? Perhaps all we can say is that he died doing what he loved. Or perhaps there's more. It may be that in the depths of our mysterious and powerful response to metaphor and our surrender of will, we shall discover a bigger meaning and an architecture to love itself.